Our next speaker is Susan McDaniel.
Let me just say that Ms. Stopa said in the beginning that we were going to be a diverse lot. We are really going to be diverse. So I'm at a bit of a disadvantage here because, for two reasons. One is I come from Alberta, egads, but I don't represent anybody in Alberta. I'm an academic, so don't blame me for what goes on there. Second thing is that I don't do any research on food. So I'm going to talk about population. And Brewster gave a nice introduction of some of these issues of population, the contours of some population issues in relation to resources and include food, but food is not what I do except as an avid consumer. When I'm asking, is population the problem, I'm asking, is it the only problem? And this was hinted at earlier on. I'm not saying, and I want to give you a clear idea of my conclusion before I begin, because I might get cut off, that I'm not saying at all that population doesn't matter. I think it matters greatly, but I don't think it's a linear, simple relationship to food and food production and resources as many people think. I think it's much more complicated than that, and I can only get into a little of the complexity. So I'm not of the school that population doesn't matter. I don't want you to go away with that impression. Clearly, the Earth's population is soaring, and it does not have infinite resources, as we all know. At the question of providing food and other resources that people seem to want, water, energy are crucial ones. And of course, televisions, cars, and holidays and the sun are increasingly in demand, is a question. And what do we do now, and what do we do in future, and who does it, and who decides? I think Brewster illustrated that brilliantly, so I won't go into my little rant on that I was going to. I'm going to just mention the Reverend Thomas Malthus, because I'm sure he's going to come up in discussions here one way or the other. His book, an essay on the principle of population, talked about the power of population being infinitely greater than the power of the earth to produce subsistence for man. Now, of course, he was writing in the early 1800s, so he was talking about a different kind of relationship than we have now. Now, I'm not of the school that technology is going to save us, but there still is a different technological relationship between food and population, intermediary between food and population. A crucial thing to remember when we talk about Malthus, and this part is often forgotten, when we talk about epidemics, pestilence, plague, all those disasters that might come from overpopulation, he said those would only come, and remember he's a reverend, they would only come if virtue failed. So virtue is supposed to play a big role in this, morality. Now our question of morality and what that means is quite different than his. Because I think he had a different sense of morality for one class than for another. And that's a theme through population control, and it still is. And I think Brewster made that point, that morality is for them, not necessarily for us, because we're already superior, or whoever we are, and that can be defined differently in different contexts. So this virtue and morality and who is we runs through the whole discussion. The question we ask, or I ask, we won't say we anymore, is Malthus right if he ever was? And there's been a lot of discussion about whether he was ever right. Can food, sustenance, all kinds of things we need for life match predicted future population growth, and under what circumstances? Okay, the world population, as Mustafa said when he introduced us, is clearly increasing. Although the way in which that's happening, the contours of that analytically are not exactly what we're told all the time are. So let me get into that a little bit. First of all, the world population is not increasing to the same degree all over the world. The biggest growth is in Asia. It's not what we commonly think of as Africa, South America, Latin America. The biggest growth is in Asia. And that's a different phenomenon than we usually talk about when we talk about less developed parts of the world and developed parts of the world, because the problems and the diversity in Asia is monumental, as it is in Africa and Latin America, but it's probably even greater in Asia. The world population, I have this graph where the population is and the size equals inhabitants. You can tell that instantly when we look at our homeland here. Look at that little shrivelly thing above the United States there. We're really tiny in relation to the world. But the point should be made, and I want to make this point as we go along here, that we do have people without adequate food in a tiny country a population like Canada. So we have this little bitty shrivelly place up there above the United States, but we have people who are starving in this city, in this country, and that matters, and I'm going to mention how that matters in a minute. I want to specifically talk about China and India in terms of the relation of population to resources, because these are interesting current examples that defy some odds in fascinating ways. First of all, when we look at total fertility rates, and I've only used some examples here, and this goes against logic because I'm putting as number one the highest fertility rate in the world, and as number 195 the lowest fertility rate in the world. The first thing you notice is that China has a higher fertility rate than the United States, but lower than Canada. And India, of course, has a higher fertility rate, a considerably higher fertility rate than than China, than the US and Canada. I'll talk about Russia in a moment because I want to throw that into the mix, but I can return to this slide to show you where that stands. So keep in your mind where that stands in terms of fertility. In India, the finance minister in September 2009 said India had weathered the global economic crisis. The 2009 annual growth rate in India was 6%. Predicted to be 8% by 2010. Remember, they have a very high fertility rate. They're an economic powerhouse. Yet, 17% of its economy is agricultural, with high birth rates, high illiteracy, particularly among women, and this is a theme that comes back again, high suicide rates and death rates. So it's a very, very mixed picture, and yet the economic growth rate is quite substantial. China has an annual growth rate in GDP in 2008 of 9%. In 2007, it was 13%. Clearly, everyone who lives on this planet now knows that China is a huge economic powerhouse, owning most of the debt, the public debt in the United States. So definitely a player on the world scene. People are talking, instead of the group of 8, they're talking about the group of 2 now, which would be the United States and China. India, with its higher birth rate than the United States and much higher than Canada, China has a lower birth rate than the United States, but higher than Canada. Look at how it plays out in GDP. Canada has a GDP growth rate from 2007 to 2008, 0.4%. The United States is 1.1. China and India I've already mentioned. It's clearly not entirely related to population. If we look at Russia, and this is a fantastic example that people don't seem to know about demographically, Russia is experiencing rapid population decline. Since the 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which has been celebrated around the world, the life expectancy of Russian men has plummeted by about 20 years, on average. So that means the life expectancy for many is way under 55, but it averages 55 years old now for men. What does this mean? And you can see the bottom falling out, essentially, of the natural increase, which is the green line at the bottom there. Adding in Russia's GDP growth to what I mentioned earlier, the population growth rate is listed on the right here. The GDP growth rate is listed here. Russia, despite the fact that it has lost population growth, has a GDP growth of 5.6%. So my view is here that it's time to rethink global population, or demographics as you put it, and its relation to resources and economics. Not in a clear way. Population still plays a role, but it's not as clear as one might think. From the Sunday Times in the UK, in London, in May of this year, the Billionaire Club, America's richest people, meet to discuss ways of tackling a disastrous, which is their term, environmental, social, and industrial threat. The Billionaire Club met in secret. Why? Well, this is a quote from the Times in London. They wanted to speak rich to rich without worrying anything that they said would end up in newspapers, painting them as an alternative world government. So there you go. What is their conclusion? That population growth was the biggest problem the world faces. Well, this is the kind of people that Brewster outlined. This is Bill Gates and his foundation, which may do some good work. I'm not saying that, but it's people in the United States who are rich.